Good morning. This morning, if you will, open up to Matthew chapter 12. That's where we're going to be. Matthew chapter 12, and we're going to try to answer two questions. One question is, what exactly did Jesus mean when he said these words? That's always an important question to ask. And the second question is, why do I follow what God has commanded me to do? And the answer to both of those questions will make a pretty big impact in what we do and how we act and how we respond to God. So, like I said, Matthew chapter 12, we're going to start out with a little bit of context. We'll start with verse 1. Matthew 12, verse 1, it says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.'" So this story takes place on the Sabbath day. According to Jewish law, you should do no work. What was defined as work in the law was pretty limited, as in it didn't tell you very much. But over time, the Jews developed a pretty strict system of what was considered work and what was not. And the Pharisees, of course, were foremost among keeping the laws that had been added onto the actual law of God. So they are trying to, in theory, make sure that nobody breaks the law. The Pharisees, for a little bit more background, they come out of about 200 years before Christ, out of a group that called themselves the pious ones, and their goal was to prevent Greek culture that was coming in from taking away from the Jewish law, taking away from Jewish culture as a whole. And so they saw themselves as sort of guardians of the culture and guardians of the law, but in doing so, like we're mentioning right here, they really added to the law. They added what man thought to what God had actually spoken. And so one of the questions that we'll have is, when they say that what Jesus' disciples is doing is unlawful, is it unlawful according to God's law, or is it unlawful according to their law that they've added in? They also, though, bring up a bigger issue here. Maybe Jesus' response brings up a bigger issue. Jesus is going to give a couple of examples in response to this accusation that's being made. And just to clarify, the accusation is Jesus' disciples have broken the law because they have taken the heads of grain and have eaten them. So you take them, rub the end of the grain together, you get the kernels from the grain, you would eat that. So that's the accusation. Jesus' response, though, is going to bring in these examples. One of them is David. And the example of David is kind of questionable as to what it means. And that's one of the things that we'll try to discover, is what exactly Christ meant with this example. But some people have taken this example to say that what Christ is showing is situational ethics. That is, what David did, maybe it was right because of the circumstances he was in. And maybe that sets a precedent for us that sometimes the law is only true here and not over here. Well, obviously we'll try to address that as well. So, looking at this statement, we'll start with verse 3 again. It says, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest." So this is this first example. The accusation is, your disciples are hungry and they're doing something wrong. And he says, hey, haven't you read that David, in a very similar circumstance, did something like this? And according to what Christ says here, he says that he ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat. So let's clarify a couple of points here. One, the showbread was a bread. It was literal, physical bread that was baked every week. And so it would stay in the temple for a week's time. And it was there kind of as a representation of the bread that was given in the wilderness. But at the end of the week, it would be for the priest to eat. And so this bread was given to the priest, not just any priest, but the descendants of the high priest, the Aaronic priest. And so they were allowed to eat the bread. And according to the law, that would be true. That's Leviticus chapter 24, verses 8 and following. So we do get that from the law. But what Jesus says here sort of in agreement with that, at least it sounds like it is, that it was not lawful for David to eat this bread. Okay, so there you have it, right? David was in the wrong. He clearly shouldn't have eaten the bread, and that's the end of the story. Well, maybe. There's a second example that Jesus gives. The second example, in verse 5, he says, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" So just to clarify what he's talking about here, Sabbath law says you are to do no work, except what? The priests still work on the Sabbath. They still make sacrifices on the Sabbath. They still have to do all the same things that they do the rest of the week. And so they profane the Sabbath every time they do that. Is that really what Christ means? Is he really saying that every Sabbath the law contradicts itself so poorly that God had given that the priests break the Sabbath? Well, no. Christ is not saying that, so what is he saying? Well, if he's saying that David was unlawful in his actions, and that the priests profane the Sabbath in their actions when in fact they are blameless, what he's saying is, you Pharisees, you would say that the priests are profaning the Sabbath, just as you're accusing my disciples of doing. You would look at David and you would say that he did something unlawful, just as you point to my disciples and say the same. He's giving these examples not to say that these people were actually wrong, but to say, hey, look, this is a similar example where maybe you would actually understand that these people weren't in the wrong, but had a reason for doing this. So let's take this a little bit farther. In verse 6, it says, "Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple." I've given you two examples using the temple, but remember that Christ, while on earth, he's of greater importance than the temple. He is a better example even than these. And if these things were right to do in the temple, how much more when the temple of God is here on earth with them? Verse 8 is pretty similar. It says, "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." He is in control of everything. He is above everything. That being said, Jesus isn't just saying, because I'm here, it's okay for them to do this. But there's another reason that comes into play. So back to verse 7. It says, "But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." I think this is part of where we can understand that the two examples that Jesus gives are in fact innocent examples that have not broken any law except the law of the Pharisees. He says that you have condemned the guiltless, as in my disciples, and you would have condemned the priests, even though they were commanded to work, and you would have condemned David all the same. And he's saying that these people are blameless, and there's a reason for it. And the reason goes back to this quote that he takes from the Old Testament, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So he takes that from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. And what he is trying to get across here is, as he's already done with these examples, there are times when there is a law that is superseded by, it is overridden by, a law that is more fundamental than the one that they are trying to appeal to. The idea in any kind of serious study, it has different names. We'll call it qualification right now. But the idea is that a statement or a second commandment can alter the first one. And we know that to be true. And Christ gives a lot of examples of that, and we'll give a lot of examples of that to make sure we're all on the same page. But there are times when a commandment has been given, and yet there's another command that has to be weighed alongside that command. And the two have an effect on one another. And so that's what's going to happen here as well. Yes, there's a command about the Sabbath, but there are other commands that are important to the situation as well. When Jesus makes his appeal to the priest, we'll talk about that for a second. What he's saying is that the priests do in fact have an exemption from the law of the Sabbath because of the command that they have been given. So that first example of the priest, what he's really saying is, you should acknowledge that there are times when the law of the Sabbath to not work is overridden by something else. Obviously, the priests are not at fault when they serve on the Sabbath, okay? Then in the example of David, Jesus is appealing to a more fundamental law than what the Pharisees are appealing to. They're looking at this law of the Sabbath and saying, you can't do this because, and Christ says, actually, let me take you back even farther. It's almost the exact parallel to Matthew chapter 19, whenever the idea of divorce and marriage is brought up, and Christ, in response to the accusation that Moses allowed divorce, he says, yes, Moses allowed divorce, but it was not so from the beginning. He takes it back before the law of Moses and says, yes, but you've forgotten that there was law before that law ever existed. And so what we're saying here is that the law that Christ is appealing to is the law from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, the law of mercy. Now, the law of mercy is not written out in the Ten Commandments. The law of mercy is not any of the 600 commandments of the Old Testament. And yet the law of mercy has always been there. It's a law that is older. It's a law that is more foundational to what God is than most other laws are at all. And so we look at this law of mercy and we say that basically it's a law that mirrors who God is. It is, be merciful for I am merciful. How much more foundational can you get to your understanding of God than to say that if you're going to follow God, you need to be like God? And so what Christ is saying is, yes, there is a law about the Sabbath, but there's also a law that says you should act like God acts. And sometimes those two will come into conflict. In the case of David, and in the case of Jesus' disciples, the reason that he brings up mercy as one of these specific laws that might override the law of the Sabbath is that David is receiving mercy. If you remember the situation, David is on the run. David doesn't have anything. He doesn't have access to his bank account, as we would think of it today. He doesn't have a whole lot of access to anything. And he doesn't have a lot of friends either at the time. And so whenever he goes to the temple, he doesn't really explain why he's there in the first place. He has to kind of keep that secret. But when he asks for bread, he needs bread in order to keep himself and his men alive. And so the priest, in giving them bread, is acting on the law of mercy. He's acting on this law that goes so far back that it would even predate the Sabbath. The same thing is true in a sense for the disciples of Christ here as well. That they're appealing to the law of mercy. They're the recipients of mercy. How? Well, the law provided that if you were a couple of things. If you were a foreigner in the land, if you were poor, or even potentially if you were just traveling, that you have this option to take of the grain of the field. There's actually two different laws in play here. The one from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 10, is the one that we're really familiar with, that says that you don't take all the grapes, you don't go over the wheat the second time, you leave some in the field. So that's part of the mercy that God's law is showing there, even through the Mosaic law. But also in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, very specific to this situation, if you're walking through your neighbor's field, you are in fact allowed to take the grain. You're just not allowed to cut it down and take it in a basket with you. But you can get enough to eat. And so they're appealing to these laws from the Mosaic law, which would make it okay in and of itself. But really what they're doing is they're taking part in the law of mercy. That they're being provided for. Their physical needs are being provided for by the mercy of God, as he has provided through his law. And so what do the Pharisees do in response to that? They say, how dare they be the recipients of mercy? How dare needy people get what they need so long as it's the Sabbath day? And what Christ says is, you've got it so backwards that you're trying to keep God's law, and in keeping God's law, you've removed mercy from it altogether. You've taken the love out of it just to get to the strictness of it. The problem is, if me trying to follow God's law leads to actions that have no mercy, then I'm not following God's law in the first place. And so that's where we find the Pharisees here as well. So what is the point of what Christ is trying to say here? The point is not to say that human need is more important than the law. We're not saying that just because his disciples were hungry, that made it right. What we're saying is that they were appealing to a law that is older, that is, for the words of Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23, it's one of the weightier matters of the law, which of course the Pharisees regularly ignored. But we look at those weightier matters of faith and mercy and justice and say those things are older than this law to keep the Sabbath holy. Those things are more fundamental to who God is, and therefore they have to be kept. And so with that, it's important for us to point out that we're not saying that we've made an excuse for Jesus' disciples breaking the law. We didn't do that. They didn't break the law. We're not making an excuse for the priest breaking the law of the Sabbath, or for David breaking the law of the Sabbath, because they did not. When there are two laws that are somewhat in opposition to one another, the one that's closer to what God desires and is more like him is the one that is to be followed, because it qualifies the other. It alters the other. So how do you know then, if that's the case, if one law can alter another, how do you know when to follow that? And I think we can probably keep it very simple, maybe even overly simple, to go back to a phrase that all of us are familiar with, a question that's asked, which is, what would Jesus do? Well, he gives us his answer here. He would, if the occasion required it, not submit himself to the law of the Sabbath, but even to the law of mercy, because it is so close to the heart of God. But more practically, we see Jesus talk about this principle a lot, especially when it comes to the Sabbath, because that's one of the points that the Pharisees were so strong on. So you remember some of these other commands. You remember in John chapter 7 and verse 22, he gives the example where he says of the Sabbath day that if you have a son who's born, and then 8 days later it happens to be the Sabbath day, what are you still going to do according to Jewish law? You're still going to circumcise him. Why? Because that law has overridden the law of the Sabbath. He says the same thing in Luke chapter 13 and in verse 15. He says, if you, being even a decent person, have an animal and it falls into a ditch on the Sabbath day, and even though there's a command for you to do no work whatsoever, what are you going to do? You're going to not let the animal suffer. You're going to get them out of the ditch. And so we're not saying there's situational ethics. It's not that there's circumstances that change the law. All of these things go back to the same law. Well, maybe not the circumcision one, but even the animal life is appealing to the same law of mercy. To say that you can't follow God's command so strictly that it removes mercy from that command altogether. Mercy has to win out. It has to take precedence. Again, to give a different example, not with the Sabbath, Jesus, in another example of combating the ideas of the Pharisees, some of them were apparently, according to Christ, were looking to their parents and saying, I'd love to help you out in your old age. I'd love to take care of you in retirement. I'd like to be there for you, but everything that I would have given to you is Corban. It is given to God instead. And so basically, instead of helping you out, I'm going to put it in the contribution every week. And Christ says that's not right either. Why? Well, because yes, technically, it's following one of God's laws, but what has it done? It's removed the even more fundamental laws of God, of honoring your parents, and of showing mercy and showing love. Again, if our actions in trying to be obedient to God end up with actions that have no mercy or love, then we are not being obedient to God. So sometimes in trying to be careful and trying to preserve laws so faithfully, it can actually end up that we are going against the law of God. We're not saying, on the other hand, though, that rules are meant to be broken or anything like that, but they are meant to be weighed properly. To give a more modern example, there are times, in spite of us being commanded to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, there are times when you must not attend worship. Why? Well, Jesus gives one example in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 23. He says that if you are going to the temple to make an offering, going to the altar, and you there remember that your brother has something against you, what do? You leave the gift and you go to your brother and you solve the problem. Why? Because that goes back to an older law. It goes to one that says, well, what would Jesus do? What would God have you to do? Which one becomes more important? more practically, this happened the other night. I was supposed to speak at Stanford on Sunday night, and instead, Olivia and I both went to the ER. Okay? Well, if we were being more like the Pharisees, what would we have said? Well, at least she wouldn't have gone, right? She should have just dropped me off and gone on, because you're trying to follow the law so precisely. But what would we say instead? That the law of mercy requires that sometimes you go with your spouse to the ER? The law of mercy, if you were on the way to the building this morning, would require you, if you saw an accident and there were no emergency services there and it was clear that there were injuries, it would require you to stop. The law of mercy would. Now, if we only appeal to the law that says that we need to attend church services, then we wouldn't stop. And you'd have to think of the parallel there with the Good Samaritan. If you went by and you drove past and you said, well, I've got something more religious to do, you'd be the same as the priest and the Levite who pass on by while the Samaritan lays there dying. The law of mercy has to win out. And it does every time that we see it in the example of Christ. God desires, above all, that we act like him. That's the quote from Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The sacrifice is important. The sacrifice should be done in obedience to God's command. But mercy always comes first. It has to. Because God wants us to be like him. He wants us to follow him. He wants us to be obedient to him. He wants us to do these things, not because they're written in a list of rules for us. He wants us to do them because we've become like him. Because our heart has been changed to be more like God's. The one last thing that we'll say as another way to look at this, it might be easy enough to come away from this lesson with an improper understanding of what we've talked about this morning. So to clarify this one more point, while it's true that if our obedience to God leads to actions that are without mercy, that's not obedience in the first place. And while it's true that what we're really asking is, well, what would Christ do? And we're trying to look at this through the light of the golden rule and say, well, if I would want to be done this way, then this is how I should treat someone else. That works to a point, but nothing that we're saying this morning would exempt us from another Christ-like behavior. Because it would be easy to look at this and try to say, well, maybe mercy should mean that if someone's living in sin, that I don't point that out to them. And maybe mercy means that nobody really needs to repent. And maybe mercy means that you don't have to change or be obedient to God. And it doesn't mean any of that. Because it's not merciful to allow someone to keep living a life that leads them away from God. There is no mercy in that. And if I ask the question again, what would Christ do? He would show mercy every time, but sometimes mercy is telling people like the Pharisees to their face, you are in the wrong and you need to change. And so what would Christ do? He would show mercy. He would also extend his own invitation to come closer to himself. And so this morning we do the same. We offer this opportunity for anyone that has need, whether that be to come to God and become a child of his through the process that he's laid out in his word, or if you need to repent and come back to him, or if you have some other need, we ask that you come now as we stand, as we sing.